The learning continues. And now we're going to talk about engagement design. At in-person events, attendees find connection in serendipitous moments, but in a virtual event, there isn't really an opportunity for that connection by accident. So we must design for connection on purpose. Our next speaker is an expert in just that. Please join me in welcoming to the stage with the most emojis you can possibly type in 30 seconds, the founder and CEO of Scaling Intimacy, Jenny Sauer Klein. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you, Beth. I'm so glad to be here. I feel like I didn't get the antlers memo, but I wish I had the ears. I'm in the Christmas spirit and the holiday spirit with all of you, and so honored to be here as part of this event with you today. My core purpose and passion in life is connection and all about community. So I feel like I'm with my people, and I'm excited to share this content with you today. So we're going to bring up the slides and jump right in because I know we have a tight timeline, and I really want to give you some tangible, actionable tools that you can use to create connection in your events, programs, trainings, meetings, however you gather your community. We're going to go through these 5 keys to virtual connection and talk about the ways that you can apply them. So first, I just would love to invite you to post in the chat, thinking about, let's just talk about the elephants in the room, right? What are the doubts and concerns that you have about virtual connection, right? There's a lot of things that might come up for us when we think about virtual connection, and we might be just like, man, I just want to wait till we get back in person. Like, is this even possible to have authentic virtual connection online when we can't be in person, when we can't see each other eye to eye, right? How do we replicate that? So just posting in the chat as you have thoughts and ideas about your doubts and concerns, your hesitancies, your resistances, right? This is your chance to like complain, basically, and just get everything off your chest. And often, the kind of comments that we see here are really about, we can't see each other, we can't feel each other. It's really hard to read the room. There's like this attendee engagement, right? So people are distracted. They're multitasking. There's attrition. So like people RSVP, but they don't show up, or they come, but then they drop off. There's this lack of feeling authentically connected, that we're not in the same room together, right? So thank you for all the answers you're putting in the chat right now. Worried that everyone is sick of Zoom calls, right? People have the Zoom fatigue. And I will say to you right now, and as we go through this session together, I believe there is no such thing as Zoom fatigue. There's just poorly facilitated Zoom gatherings. So let's imagine that Zoom fatigue is not a thing, but it's really up to us to reinvent this medium and to make it engaging and to make it authentic and to make it come alive as much as we can. So thinking about that, perfect segue. How do we look at the glass as half full? Because as we know, virtual is not going anywhere, right? So this was glass half empty. These are the things that are challenging. They're all completely legitimate. And you're right, these are challenges that we need to work with. And let's look at the bright side, right? So how is the glass half full? How can connecting virtually be just as good or maybe even better than connecting in person? So want you now to flip the switch and think from the other perspective and imagine the ways in which it might be just as good or even better, right? Like blow your mind. Could it be even better? What are the ways in which connecting online can be just as good as in person? What are the benefits? What are the opportunities that we have when we meet online, when we are in these virtual platforms? Knowing, again, some platforms are more conducive than others to virtual connection, but how can we leverage the opportunities that we have? So place those in the chat if you haven't yet already. So things coming through here, oftentimes what we hear in response to this is, there's no geographic barriers, right? We're just cutting through the time zones. We're making things more accessible. Yes, this global participation from different parts of the world, things that would not be possible. I can say for sure in my own community has grown exponentially in the Scaling Intimacy School of Experience Design because we're able to offer it to everyone. It's been amazing, right? So we're just taking the accessibility, makes it a lot easier. Also, we see sometimes introverts are feel more connected, feel more alive, feel more comfortable in these environments. PJs are okay, right? Nobody knows what you're wearing from the waist down. You roll right out of bed, right? So if you're a parent or a caregiver, or if you have things going on in your own home, it can be a lot easier to jump on a session and to participate. There's no commute, right? There's no no pollution in the air. You don't have to get on a plane. You don't have to hire a babysitter or book a hotel, right? So there's a lot of ways in which accessibility is really much better when we're online. So those are really helpful. Thank you so much. And greater diversity, absolutely. Thank you for sharing those. So the reality is that people are not coming to events, meetings, and programs just for content, right? They are coming for connection, culture, and community. And I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here. I don't have to convince you folks that that is the reality. Content is important, but it's not as important, I would say, as this establishing of connection, culture, and community. And every time we gather, whether that's in person or online, whether it's a meeting or a training or an all hands experience, these are moments and opportunities for us to practice our values, for us to create authentic, meaningful relationships. So how do we take advantage of that? As Beth said in the intro, the reality is that in-person events, connection happens often by serendipity, right? Where we're waiting online for the restroom or at lunch, or we're sitting next to someone at the keynote or the workshop. But at virtual and hybrid events, if we don't plan for connection on purpose, right, we risk that it may not happen at all. So as you're creating your agenda, we actually have to set time aside for those moments of connection. And the design here is thinking about when we get into that state, right? Oftentimes we think about, I have to choose between connection or content, but the reality is that you can have both. And we all know that when time gets pressed and we're in a tight squeeze, connection is the first thing that hits the cutting room floor. So it's something that we need to preserve and we need to prioritize. And a debrief is a great way that you can marry content and connection. And we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. The reality is that connection catalyzes content. When we put people into a state of connection, they're awake, they're alive, they're present, they're receptive, they're relaxed. So anything that you plant in that fertile awareness is going to land even more deeply. So a moment of connection before you deliver content actually means that that content is going to have even more impact. So the design principle here is that less is more. Again, you just want to leave a little bit of space and time. A little bit of connection goes a long way. So let's dive into our 5 keys. We're going to start off with our first key, which is turning passive observers to active participants. Engagement is your number one priority. So we'll talk more about how engagement and connection are related, but if you are not able to engage your audience, if you're not able to keep and hold their attention, nothing else beneficial will happen. So that is the first thing that you want to do. And in virtual environments, there are more distractions and little to no accountability, right? You've got text messages and notifications, everything coming at you, kids and pets and partners, everything that's happening in your home. And we're not in a social environment, right? Where if you were in person, there might be this social pressure to not be on your phone or not be multitasking. So I don't know actually to what degree you're paying attention, but I have to design for that. I have to design for pulling you back in and doing my best to engage you as much as possible, which basically means avoid being boring at all costs, right? So that 45-minute keynote that we used to do in person is just not going to work online. Anything that might be a little bit boring in person is going to be 10 times more boring online. So you just want to avoid that as much as possible. You want to think about being interactive, participatory, engaging, and involving, because the average adult attention span is 8 seconds. That's 1 second less than a goldfish. It is so fast, it just went by right now. So if I'm not doing something to pull you back in, I'm going to lose you. And that's just the truth. So again, we're turning passive observers into active participants. And a way you can think about doing this is by breaking down your content into 5-minute segments and then adding and inserting a little element of engagement, whether that's a poll, a breakout, a question in the chat, some solo reflection and writing, anything to jog people back into a state of action. You're asking them to do something. Okay, that means that connection, here's the connection and engagement segue. Connection is your most effective engagement strategy. And that is because it creates accountability. When I'm asking you to connect with a group, with a person, it means that you're going to show up fully, not only for yourself, but for that person or for that group. So that is why connection is your best engagement strategy. We're going to move on now to key number 2. Key number 2 is connect early. So when we connect early, it's important because the beginning sets the tone for everything to come, right? When you first pop on a virtual call or environment, your mind is making meaning out of everything. You're looking to find out, what is the culture? How does this universe operate? What are the norms and expectations here? And we want to set the tone that connection is important and connection is a priority. So some ideas upon arrival, you can have some background music to ease the awkwardness of that unofficial start, right? Those few minutes where people are trickling on the line, high energy, low energy, upbeat, a pop song, an oldies, classic rock, something that is going to set the tone again for the energetic level of your event. You want to put a welcoming prompt in the chat, right? Maybe you want to ask for a high and low from this past week, or when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up? Something that gets the conversation started and gets people sharing something meaningful about themselves with the group. You can have folks change their screen name. Maybe they want to add their gender pronouns. Maybe they're going to add a nickname that they've had in the past, or they could change their virtual background so that right away we see a place that's held significant meaning in their life. So these are just some really quick ways, right as people land, that you can set the tone for connection. I also highly recommend you do an actual connection exercise in the first 10 minutes of your event. So right towards the beginning. This is an actual facilitated icebreaker. It can be a simple question prompt, so don't get overwhelmed like you have to do some big complicated thing here, right? You can just ask a powerful question, put people in small breakouts of 2 or 3, which is going to work really well for both your introverts and your extroverts. And it can be as quick as 5 minutes. So again, it doesn't need to be long to create the atmosphere of connection. So that is our second principle of connecting early. So what are some of your favorite opening questions and icebreakers? Feel free to drop them in the chat. Curious, this is a great opportunity to learn from each other and see what you do to invoke connection in your events, your programs, your trainings. And I love doing this because I get so inspired and I learn all these new great questions that I might use in my events and with my community. So thinking about what are the things that you use to create connection in your events? What kind of prompts do you use? And putting those in the chat. So I'm seeing a shared Spotify playlist. That's awesome. I just kicked off a 6-month program yesterday, and that's one of the things we ask people to put their hype song, their song that's like, yeah, I feel amazing when I listen to the song, coffee or tea, right? So you can do a lot of those binary questions, this or that, and that's a really fun one. Are you dog person, cat person, early morning, night owl? What did you want to be when you grew up? One of my favorites, I think, is super, super insightful. The weirder, the better. Yeah. So over the basic icebreaker games, right? We may have a big repertoire of those, but it's up to us to constantly be refreshing that so that we can bring something new, hip, and interesting to our audience. How many tabs do you have open right now? I like one. What is your most frequently used emoji? And what does that say about you? Right? Because we all have that emoji that we use all the time. Chunky or smooth peanut butter, milk or cereal. Awesome. These are great. So moving on, keep those coming as much as you like, because again, you might get some great ideas from each other. Key number 3 is to connect often, right? So it's not just connecting early, but it is connecting often, and doesn't have to be long, but it does want to be frequent because we want to weave that web of connection. We want to pull connection as a thread throughout our entire event. So looking for these micro moments, these small opportunities that we have, here's some ideal moments where you might want to think about adding some connection. So after a speaker, panel, or presentation to debrief content, we talked earlier about content and connection. So when you feel like, oh man, I don't have time for connection, a debrief is a great way to have both. So it helps people to connect with someone else while sharing something meaningful that they just learned from the content that was shared. You can do connection after a break or a meal to refocus, right? People have just gone out into the world, into their homes, into their lives. They come back. They're probably feeling scattered. They're thinking about what's going to happen later. Their physical body is there, but they haven't actually arrived. So how do you help them to recenter and refocus? You can do a moment of connection when the energy dips to revitalize. So generally for many people, a moment of connection actually gives them energy. And again, you want to think about that for both your introverted and extroverted community members, how to do that in a way that's welcoming to both. And lastly, you can think about doing connection before you close to reflect on the experience, right? Putting people in small breakouts or even in the chat. What's something that you're taking away from today? What's something that you want to do differently tomorrow based on the experience that we've shared here together? Moving on to key number 4. This one has 2 parts. These are different connection strategies. So one is wide and shallow, and the other is narrow and deep. So we're going to compare them both and think about when and how each one might be appropriate for your event. So if we look at the wide and shallow approach to start, this is really to create a high volume of new connections quickly. And this would be ideal for bigger groups, for new groups or groups of strangers, or when you have a short time frame. So this kind of an event is a perfect example of a wide and shallow approach, right? We want to just get those connections flowing as quickly as possible with as many new people as possible, because when we do that, we're creating a web of connection. One of the exercises I love doing that is a wide and shallow approach is a game called Commonalities, where you get people in small groups of 2 or 3, you put them in breakouts, you give them a couple of minutes to find as many things as possible that they have in common that are not obvious. So obvious would be we have brown eyes, or we're on a computer. So you're looking for something a layer or 2 deeper, like I'm an only child, I grew up in New York City, I went to college in Boston. Those are all true for me. So you're looking for that in a group. And when you come back to the main room, you're finding out how many things the groups found in common. You're having some people share interesting things they discovered. So that would be wide and shallow approach to connection. Now let's look at the narrow and deep approach to connection, which is where we have small groups that are going to meet multiple times. So you're building layers of connection over time. And this would be ideal for smaller groups if you have an established group or an intact team, or if you have a longer time frame. And longer might be like you have a full day, or it might be longer, meaning this program or community is spanning over many months or many years, right? So you want to be continuing to have that cumulative effect of the connection that's happening multiple times and with the same people. So as an example, I could take that game Commonalities, start with that wide and shallow approach, then keep people in the same group and ask them to pick one of the things that they had in common. Like, let's say everyone was born and raised in New York City, then they would talk about what that experience was like for them. And we give them a bit more time. So now it's storytelling, you're dropping in deeper, you're having more time to share. And that would be a narrow and deep approach to connection. And this is really about weaving a web of connection. And I love this graph because it really just brings to life this idea of every time you're connecting early, you're connecting often, you're making these different touch points. It's building that web of connection so that when you get into the gallery view and you're seeing that anonymous gallery of faces, now feels like a community, now feels like a group of friends. Even if I haven't met each one of those people, the few people that I have met, it sprinkles out, right? It starts to envelop the whole feeling of the group itself, that I feel more connected to everyone as a whole. So curious in the chat if you'd like to put down thinking about an upcoming engagement that you might have, a meeting, a training, a workshop, something that you're doing with your community, thinking about which approach would be more relevant for you. Is it the wide and shallow approach, or the narrow and deep approach? And by shallow, I don't mean meaningless. I just mean easy to access, right? So what's something that they can do really quickly, really easily, that still has meaning to it? So thinking about the wide and shallow or the deep and narrow for yourself, and just drop it in the chat. And I'm seeing both come through. Totally makes sense, right? And depending on the engagement, you'll do one or the other. And if you have time, awesome if you have a chance to do both. So last key is key number 5, gradually increasing vulnerability. Because if we go too far too fast, people hit the panic zone, fight, flight, freeze. They leave your event, they don't come back, right? If you ask them, like, what's the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to you? They're gonna bounce, right? So we want to invite vulnerability gradually. And this quote is from a group of researchers in the late 1990s that did a study on the development of interpersonal relationships. And they found that one key pattern associated with the development of a close relationship among peers is sustained, escalating, reciprocal, personal self-disclosure. So a couple of drop downs there. Those are a lot of big words. Sustained, meaning that it's happening over time. escalating, it's going deeper in intensity, reciprocal, both or all parties are doing it. And it's personal self-disclosure. So it's not just professional or theoretical. It's personal. It's about me. It's about my experience and my life. So we're sharing part of our humanity. And when we share part of our humanity, that's what makes us feel closer together. And fun little factoid here is that study used those 36 questions that make you fall in love with anyone. That was that big article in the New York Times in 2015. So those were the people that initiated that content. So as we've gone through all 5 keys to connection, you made it through them all. Curious to hear in the chat, what is your main takeaway from today? What is the thing that stood out to you? It might be a principle, it might be a practice, it might be something like less is more, or engage, or 8 seconds attention span, or connecting early, find a new icebreaker, right? What are the things that, as we've gone through this strong and powerful 20 minutes, that is standing out to you, something that you could use, something that you could remember, it's a gem that you want to take with you, something that you want to put into practice right away. So just putting those in the chat for yourself so that you make sure to remember what is most important for you as you walk away from this session. Keeping things interesting. Yeah, you got to keep it moving. Absolutely. So if you would like a PDF of the slides, I'm happy to send it to you. You can drop me an email, jenny@scalingintimacy.com, or find me on LinkedIn and drop me a note. I'd love to stay connected with you. We do have a Play on Purpose booth. Many of you said, I'm so tired of the icebreakers I have. I want something more. So if you go on over to the Play on Purpose booth, I filmed over 80 in-person and virtual games, activities, and icebreakers that you can use to connect and engage your audience. It's video tutorials, so you can watch the videos and then lead the exercise the next day. And you get 20% off as a CMX member. So head on over to that booth. And thank you all so much. I think we have a few moments for a couple questions. So I'm going to open the floor for Q&A. All right. Yeah. See, someone's got to do it at some point, right? We all have to be on mute. I feel like it's just one of the things that has to happen to be a fully, truly virtual event. We were joking the other day that we'd have create slides and say, you're mute, you're talking on mute, you're muted. Yeah, Beth isn't muted, but let's see if we can hear her. We can't hear you, unfortunately. Maybe if there's opportunity to put a question in the chat on our end, I'm happy to answer any questions. Okay, here we go. Do you have any advice for increasing engagement with C-level executives in a community setting? From Alicia. Thanks for this question, Alicia. So one of the things that I have found that's really helpful is maybe 2 high-level things. One is giving people the experience that you want them to buy into, right? So if you have an audience that is skeptical and not really bought into connection or why that's important, and I've had absolutely this experience myself, then one of the things that you can do is try to insert a moment of connection with those executives. Can you say like, hey, can you give me 5 minutes or 10 minutes of our next meeting or your next gathering to do this activity together, and then let them reflect on what that experience was for them. Also, any kind of statistics or data you can share about why connection might be important, not only for them, but for their organization. If you look at Gallup, they have some great research on this around how if someone has a best friend at work, they're 7 times more likely to be engaged. So this is really, connection is a factor of high performance teams, right? And it's something that creates psychological safety. So this is a really important thing. If we want people to be able to bring their best, to collaborate at a high level, we have to feel safe to take risks and to bring the fullness of ourselves. So connection absolutely sets the stage for that. So that would be some thoughts. Hopefully that is helpful. Okay, another question from Ryan Francis. What if your audience is a bit more serious and will be turned off by personal icebreakers? That is a great question, Ryan. So one of the things I like to think about is how you can, we talked about mixing content and connection, and then a layer beneath that is how do you think about mixing the personal and professional? And I think when you have groups that you know are going to be resistant or shy to share something personal, you can put it in a professional context. So some ways I think about doing that is I could ask my group, what's one hope or fear you have for our industry as we emerge from COVID-19. So it's about our industry. It's a professional question, but it has some emotion tied to it, right? I'm asking you about a hope or a fear, so it gets at something personal. This question we talked about earlier, what did you want to be as a kid when you grew up, right? So we're invoking their childhood, a memory, but it's also about their professional career. Or I might ask a question like, who is someone who has been a mentor for you and how have they helped you grow? Or what great advice did they give you and how have you implemented that, right? So it's still professional, there's a professional context, but it's a personal question, something about their life and their experience. So that would be some of my suggestions for you. Do you have suggestions for when personal questions aren't allowed? I think hopefully that was that was addressed there. And I think we may be ready to bring Beth back into the fold. Happy to answer any other questions if we have time, but I know we might be in a moment to transition to our next section of the day. So thank you all so much for your wonderful participation and for your brilliant questions. I've so enjoyed connecting with you and hope we get to stay connected into the future.
Thank you very much, Jenny. And now that you can all hear me, let's flood the chat with our favorite emojis and make sure that Jenny knows how excited we are to have heard from her. That was fantastic. And might I also say, wonderful being on your toes for when your host didn't have any microphone there. Great job.
I got your back.
Thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank you, Beth.